if you have your Bibles, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We're going to look at this because this talks about what happens when we get angry. And it mentions here that anger often is partnered with keeping a record of wrongs. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5. Caitlin dealt with the first section last week. Love, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrongs. It keeps no record of wrongs. And I want to make a statement here, and I hope that you'll understand it. For a lot of people, they stockpile markers. They stockpile markers. Whenever anybody does something wrong, they put a check. And they just keep markers nearby them. And they just keep checking and checking off every bad thing a person does. But Christians stockpile erasers. Some people might stockpile markers, but Christians are known to stockpile erasers. They stockpile erasers. They're the most forgiving, gracious people. They're the people who bear a lot. We as believers are those who should be stockpiling erasers and not stockpiling pens and pencils to keep a record of the wrongs that people have done to us or with us or hurt us. Some people stockpile pens and markers. Other people, Christians particularly, ought to stockpile erasers when it comes to other people. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about the characteristics of people who stockpile markers and people who stockpile erasers. Because that's in essence what this means. Notice love is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrong. The word record of wrong there is an accounting term. It's the same that you would use for a budget. It's the same that you would use for keeping tabs on something. It's that kind of a term. It's an accounting term. We don't keep records of wrongdoing. But like I said, some people stockpile markers, and other people stockpile erasers. Christians, above all, should be stockpiling erasers. So what are the characteristics of people who stockpile markers, who are constantly keeping score, who hold up a scorecard and say, this is what you have to live up to. This is absolutely what you've done to me. What are the characteristics of people like that? Well, let's take a look at them. First of all, they make mountains out of molehills. Usually, it's a small thing, but when that small things happen, combined with a lot of other small things, it turns into a huge mountain. And maybe you know someone like that. The smallest thing sets them off. And they just can't get over it. And you might be asking yourself, well, why, oh, why would someone do that? I mean, this doesn't seem to be that big an issue. But people who collect markers do that. People who keep the score always do that. They just seem to make mountains out of molehills. They also are people who repay evil for evil. Now, they may not do this physically, but in their mind they do. You know, they go back and forth. If I could just. I've done that. Have you ever done that? Where you argue in your head and you tell the person in your head what you're going to do to them? And then you turn around and go, well, no, I can't do that. I'm a Christian, but boy, I'd like to get them, you know. And you're like in two minds. You just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. You may not, literally get revenge on them, but boy, you just kind of savor that. You like to fight mentally over what someone has done for you. There's something about that. And those who keep markers, they kind of want that revenge. They want that payback. And they also are resentful people. They're resentful. Let's go back to that last slide, the one prior to this. They're resentful people. There's this kind of resent that develops in them. Let me read you a quote from Lewis Smedes. He's a great writer. I've enjoyed much of what Lewis Smedes has written. He was a professor of religion and philosophy down at Fuller Seminary. And here's what he said. He said, resentment is yesterday's irritation scratched into the sensitive membranes of our memory. It is yesterday's hurt grown up into today's indignation. Planted and tended in our memory, the thorn that first pricked us now stabs away at our peace. Memories of minor hurts become major resentments. Any evil once done is an everlasting fact. In a sense, everything we do lasts forever. Pilate's cop-out goes on forever. Peter's denial reverberates through the corridors of time. Our petty sins and major deceits echo on. And one indication of the everlastingness of our actions is our memory, our personal share in living in the past. Why do we take the past into our minds and lock it there and keep it alive? Why do we prolong the hurts we've received instead of the joys of the past? Because we remember the hurts so that we can enjoy the pain of yesterday over and over again. We keep it alive for the pleasure we get for resentment to the one who hurts us. Speed says there's just something about that. And people who keep score, they kind of keep that in their mind. They just have that about them. They just go, yeah, I'm just going to hang on to that. And there's a certain sort of sense of power that we have mentally over the people who hurt us when we hold that resentment deep inside us and we don't take care of it. We don't take care of it. A fourth thing is we keep a running list of the records of hurt, and we've talked a little bit about that. A running record. We just have a way of rehearsing all the ways that we have been hurt to others. And what happens here is we end up experiencing friction in a lot of our relationships because we keep that record of wrong. It brings tension in all of our relationships. We never seem to get over it. We never get over it. And it ultimately limits us. It limits what we can do because it eats away at our body. It eats away at our mind. And there are four examples of this that I want us to look at here. It limits us. It limits our effectiveness. Moses in Numbers chapter 20 got mad. He got mad. He really got mad. And he hit the rock. And he couldn't enter the promised land. And he couldn't experience the joy of what it meant to have effectiveness. It limits our friendships. Proverbs chapter 22 tells us, avoid an angry person. Avoid an angry person. And that's true. Nobody likes to be around angry people and resentful people and people who constantly rehearse the hurts that others have done to them. Nobody likes to be around them. And it's hard. And if we hold on to these resentments, if we continually keep the score, we're going to find our effectiveness in our relationships. They're going to be harmed. They're going to be changed. They're not going to be as vibrant as they could be. Enjoyment. Jonah. It limits our enjoyment of things. Jonah is an interesting person because here he goes through the great revival, one of the greatest revivals in the Bible. One of the great ones. But he can't enjoy it. He can't enjoy it at all. He ends up going outside and saying, Lord, I knew you were this way. I knew you were compassionate. I knew you were forgiving, and I don't like it. You know why? Because I don't like the Ninevites. I don't like the Ninevites. And he kept score. I don't like them. You know, they're a crude, mean people. They invented the crucifixion. And I don't want that. I don't want to see those people come to the Lord. And I knew you would do this. And he's resentful. And instead of saying, whoa, look at the grace of God, he makes the heart of God sad. I mean, God is sad in that chapter 4. God says to him, Jonah, don't you think I should have compassion on people who don't even know their right from their left? That's children. Don't you think I should have compassion on them? Don't you think I should love them? Aren't you rejoicing in my grace even to people like the Ninevites? And Jonah just didn't get it. I mean, it limited his enjoyment because he kept score. because he held up a list and said, this is what people need to be who really love God. And he kept score. And when they didn't meet that, it bothered him. And he was resentful. And the final one here is it limits opportunity. 1 Timothy chapter 3 says that if someone takes a role in leadership, they can't because they're angry. If they're easily tempered, if they're easily angered, if they're people that fly off the handle and don't know how to control their emotions, they can't be in leadership. They shouldn't be up front. They shouldn't be able to lead, and it limits opportunities for them. And so these are the kind of characteristics, these are the things that happen when we use markers, when we keep score. I thought of a woman, her name is Margarita Lasky. Margarita Lasky. She was a author, a playwright. She was a secular humanist. She didn't believe in God. She just believed in humanity. She wrote some great books. She was Oxford trained, and people loved her. She was often on the radio, and she was often a panelist on the radio, and people really enjoyed her. But she died in February of 1988, and right before her death, somebody was talking to her who was a believer, and she said, you know what I appreciate about believers? You forgive each other and you forgive people. She said, I don't have anybody to forgive me. See, she didn't have somebody that had an eraser. It seems like all she had was people who just kept score. And she said, I wish I had somebody. I wish I had a Christian. Oh, it seems like I've got people who keep score. They hold up markers. And I need somebody with an eraser. And the world needs somebody with an eraser because, listen, the world's a tough place. And you know what? People keep score out there. They keep score out there. And then they take the person's failures and they hold it up. And they define them by their failure and their worst trait. Instead of looking all the good things a person has done or something, the world out there is a tough place because if you fail a lot of times, they will just get on you and they'll hold it up. And they need people like believers and followers of Jesus who have erasers. It doesn't mean you don't see the mark. It just means you don't hold it against them. You don't hold it over them. And Paul says that's love. Love keeps no record of wrongs. No record of wrongs. What are the qualities of a person who carries erasers? What are the qualities of a person who stockpiles erasers? Let's take a look at that. The person who stockpiles erasers. One, they've experienced the power of God's forgiveness themselves. I mean, that's what motivates people who carry erasers. They understand their own sinfulness. They understand their own depth of forgiveness, their own brokenness. They understand that God is a God of forgiveness, that He's buried their sins as far as the east is from the west, that He doesn't hold it against them. If God were to hold our sins against us, David said, who among us would stand? If He were to keep a record, none of us would stand, but He doesn't. He doesn't. Because God has a big eraser found at Calvary and found at the cross when Jesus died. And so people who've experienced this deep sense of God wiping clean that slate, they carry a big eraser. They keep those all over because they understand they themselves have been forgiven of so much themselves. A second thing is they rule out revenge as an option. Romans 12 says, do not take revenge. Leave ultimately everything to God in the long run. They know that there's two sides to every story. They know that they don't often see everything so clearly. And so they just say, God, this really situation is in your hands. I've done whatever I can. But you know, I'm just going to let it go and I'm going to leave it in your hands. I'm going to leave it in your hands. And they absorb a lot. That's a third thing. They absorb a lot. It isn't that you just ignore this. You're going to be hurt if you carry a big eraser. It's going to bother you because it seems so unjust and unfair, perhaps. And you bear a lot. You really do. You carry a lot of this around. It isn't like you just blow it off. It's hard. It's hard forgiving people who hurt you. It's hard not rehearsing these things. It's hard feeling the pain when someone takes advantage of you or hurts you. It's a hard thing. You bear a lot. But so did Jesus in forgiving us. And then they seek the Lord in prayer because Jesus says that, right? Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And then they extend God's love to other people. They extend God's love to other people. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. Love does what? Covers a what? Multitude of sins. Love covers a multitude of sins. And in Proverbs chapter 12, it says, hate is destructive, but love covers everything. Love covers everything. Hate is destructive, but love covers everything. Everything. And then finally, we remember the example of Jesus in Luke chapter 23, 34. People with erasers, think about the example of Jesus. I want you to think about how unique the words of Jesus were on the cross. People had been around a crucifixion. They'd been around crucifixions, and a lot of them. And I bet these were probably some of the most shocking words that people around the cross, I mean, put yourself around a cross. Think about a crucifixion. Think about the things that you may have heard there as you stood there. Think about the multiple hundreds of crucifixions that the Romans performed, and the things that those people on the cross, or even the people gathered around, might have said. And here's Jesus on the cross, and I bet no one ever heard a person being crucified say, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." I bet no one in history ever heard a person say that. Those are the most unexpected words that you could hear. The most unexpected words. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. There's a story of a man who came over. He was a rabbi, and he came over from Germany, and he had gone through the tragedies of the Holocaust and the tragedies of Nazi Germany. And when he got on the shore and he was here in freedom, about a month or so later, someone came to him and said, "Oh, what is it? What was the most important thing to you? When you touched on the shore, what was it like? What did you feel? What did you do? What was the first thing you did when you stepped on the soil of the United States? What was the first thing you did?" And he said, "I forgave Adolf Hitler. Because I didn't want to bring him with me. I didn't want to bring him with me." See, he had a big eraser. And he knew right there, I'm going to let him be. God will have to take care of those atrocities, but I'm not taking him with me. And, you know, all of us carry hurts. All of us who have good memories. If you have a good memory, it's a blessing, but if you have a good memory, it's a curse. Because, you know, you can remember things that happened to you with vivid pictures and colors and pain and emotion. If you have a good memory, it can be difficult, and it takes extra work not to pull a marker out. It takes extra work to pull that eraser out and just wipe the slate clean from the past.